Thank you very much. It's nice to be back after saying grace, invocation, or whatever it was this morning. What I'd like to do is to talk about a few different things today. One of the things is to talk about spirituality and aging in the context of human experience, and I may go through that relatively quickly because I think you've heard a lot about that today. I'd like to talk about some key points from the Catholic tradition, and one of the reasons I'm bringing that up is in the hospital setting, it was pretty common for someone, you'd outline a care plan that was totally reasonable, and the family would go, that's beautiful, that's wonderful, but we're Catholic, we can't do that. And then I'd have to say, oh yes, we can. And then I'd have to say, because I didn't wear a collar when I was seeing patients, I go, it's okay, I'm a Jebby, it's all right, it's okay. Sometimes that made it worse, it didn't help. Part of the thing I'd also like to do is to talk a little bit about what's called the trajectory of dying and how one looks at caring for people in different points there. And finally, highlight the role of palliative care, or at least a palliative approach to end-of-life care. Well, you've heard a lot about what spirituality is about, but one of the things I would do when I would teach my medical students is to realize it's very easy to focus on the biological, and it's nice to add the psychological, and it's important to add the social. But one of the things that we often had neglected in medical education is the role of the spiritual in that. Now, that doesn't mean that doctors are bad people. Remember, most of the people you train in medical school are in their mid-20s. And quite frankly, they don't have tons of life experience. So they are frightened sometimes with an older person who is coming to the end of their lives. And not unreasonably, they like to tinker with the medical aspects and avoid the rest. That doesn't mean they're bad, it just means we need to help them with that. Now, other ways to look about being human from a more particularly Catholic perspective, the things the Church always emphasizes is this concept of human dignity, human solidarity. From the Catholic tradition, we believe that creation is good. We acknowledge that there are problems out there and problems inside us, but as opposed to, say, some of the traditions from the Reformation, we're really quite optimistic about humanity. We recognize the reality of sin, but at the same time, we know God made us wonderful and that God really delights in us. And even when we mess up, that's not the most important part. The part is that we're still loved and cared for. Now let's talk more about this dignity and solidarity business. Richard McBrien in his book Catholicism, which I had to cram before I did my MDiv comprehensives, because at the end there's great summaries. And so what is special about Christianity? Well, really the two things that are very different is this idea that a human being is God, that Jesus Christ is true human and true God, and that's the mystery we call the incarnation. You know the middle of it, carne? It's the enfleshment, the meat of God, if you will. The other is that when we meet God, it's not only through the Word, through the Son, through Jesus, but we also have the experience, what I'd say to my students is, you know when you're up on top of a mountain, or you're on a beach, or you've really fallen in love and you go, whoa, that's the experience of God, the Creator, who Jesus called Father. And then there are other times when we feel ourselves lightened, or if we've really done something schmucky, we tend to go, hey, it's time to turn around. Those are experiences of the Spirit. And those three different experiences reflect the one God that we know as the Trinity. Well, that's sweet. What's that have to do with anything? Human dignity rests not just that we're created, but the image and likeness of God means that we're both creator, the Word that God spoke, and filled with that Spirit that binds God together. So that's why we respect individual life. But the other part is when you look at what a Trinity is, it's a unity that consists of three separate individuals but one nature. It's a harmony of love. So Catholics are pushy about respecting individual life, but at the same point, we respect the community. And so that the need for us to care for each other is not an option. One of the things, I'll probably get somebody really angry at me now, but during the recent healthcare reform is people say, well, this is unreasonable, what would he got to do, all the other stuff. And I go, well, you can't keep on going the way we are, where there are 40 million people without health insurance. Through a career in medicine and seeing people who would come to me who finally had Medicare, but they didn't have health insurance for 30 years. So then we all got to pay a ton because of their diabetes, their hypertension, all the other stuff that hadn't been taken care of. If you want to be a smart economist, it's best to avoid the problems as much as you can and not just fix a car that's pretty much wrecked up. This idea of the Trinity, our human dignity and solidarity, also leads to an idea of justice. What are right relationships within a community? Saying justice is right relationships within a community doesn't tell you much what to do, but it gives you an idea on when some of our ethical points rest. Now, this crowd, I think a number of you perhaps will remember the book of the superego God, to reveal to our last speaker, called the Baltimore Catechism. So, who made you? Why did God make you? So, the point of our life is to enjoy eternal life with God. There is a meaning to our creation, and that meaning comes from love, because we're going to find ourselves with that God who is love for all eternity. A question I used to ask all my medical students was, life in the Catholic Church, human life, is an absolute value, true or false? And then I'll go, true. Well, the answer is false. Why is it that we venerate martyrs? If life was an absolute value, then we would not respect, honor, dignify, ask these folks to talk to God for us if they died rather than renounce their faith. There are things more important than being alive. And that's what John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae was talking about when our supernatural calling highlights the relative character of each individual's human life, their earthly life. So that's one of the things to remember. The value of our human life is relative. And that will get people crazy who don't pay attention to theology. Because I get up and say that, and I have people go heretic and things like that. I might be accidentally one on occasion. I'm never a formal heretic, okay? And I'm always ready to renounce my error. But it is not an error to say that our life on earth is a relative value compared to the value of our life with God. And that notorious liberal John Paul II is my resource on that. Whoops. Excuse me. Now, what's our human existence? What's the point? It's a fullness of life which goes beyond our life on this earth. And so, although it reveals its greatness and value even when we're on earth, life on earth is not ultimate but a penultimate reality. Now, a quote that I really enjoy using was the Holy Father John Paul visited a hospice in Vienna in 1998. And he said then, both the artificial extension of human life and the hastening of death, although they stem from different principles, conceal the same assumption. The conviction that life and death are realities entrusted to human beings to be disposed of at will. It must be made clear again that life is a gift to be responsibly led in God's sight. Now, the idea of life as a gift, one that is given to us but doesn't necessarily belong to us, is profoundly cultural. The other idea, and what John Paul, I think, was saying, is both those people, in my medical career, I've always run into what I would call the prototypical good Catholic physician, who is a wonderful man, but really didn't learn his theology, usually his, that well. Because it would always be, you're in the intensive care unit and some poor old person has been through hell. They've had a million things done to them, and the doctor won't let go because I'm responsible for their death. As you know, let's just put it this way. If I have a patient in his or her 90s who has Alzheimer's and they develop pneumonia, and I appropriately make that person comfortable as they approach the end of their life, that person did not die from an endotracheal tube deficiency state. Okay? What that person died from was Alzheimer's disease and pneumonia. I am not responsible for that death. As a physician, as a caregiver, we're stewards of the gift. Now, here's the flip side, say the Dr. Kevorkian crowd. Well, if life becomes troublesome or troublesome to the individual, get rid of it. It's mine to dispose of. And again, that's not the point. Our lives are not our own. That gets back to the idea of human solidarity. It's not like the Holy Spirit or the Son or the Creator Father could say, I've had it with the Trinity, I'm going to go take a walk. That can't work out. And in the same way, even with our own lives, we're not allowed to say, I've had it with the human community. God knows we've all felt that way from time to time. But we can't act on it in a final way. Obviously, I'm pretty heavily influenced by Ignatian spirituality. And really the key thing, I think, is a part at the beginning of the spiritual exercises called the principle and foundation. And the line is, human beings are created by God. And then it goes on in some fairly late medieval language that at first glance might seem off-putting, but if you take time, you tend to get it. Everything that happens in our life reveals this God. Whether it's the good stuff or the bad stuff, a short life or a long life, having a lot of resources, not having much. God is present in all of those things. The challenge for aging, particularly in the context of life-threatening illness, is to find that God even in decline, diminishment, and death. Now, how do you understand spirituality? There's a guy, Michael Buckley, who is a Jesuit, and he talks in a book, actually it's a different context where he's talking. Primarily when you're thinking about spirituality, there are different branch points. At the beginning, it has to do with whether or not you buy into this God idea or not. Do I view that people who do not formally believe in God can have a spirituality? Yes, because it is a journey for them to find meaning in being a human being with or without one's belief in an absolute God. I think it's a lot harder to find that meaning, but I know good people who do. And that journey by which we find meaning in relation to God or another source relates to our personal spirituality. Now, that spirituality comes from somewhere. For me, it comes from having been born an Irish Catholic kid south of Boston. It comes from being the youngest son of older parents. I was the caboose or the surprise. And so I probably have a Irish Catholic Boston spirituality that's about a half generation older. I'll be 54 next Sunday. So sometimes I'm a little more comfortable hanging out with people in their 70s. That's why it's great to be the provincial of the Society of Jesus of New England. But what is the understanding displayed? Hermeneutic is a fancy way to say, how do you understand your experience and how do you communicate it? There are a variety of ways, but the point I want to talk about is when you're working with older people who are ill. Sometimes I'm dealing with people who maybe they still think of the superego God, and they did something wrong. They got divorced and remarried. They cheated on a spouse. They were a not nice person. Maybe the individual had an abortion. Illness in that context is viewed as punishment that will lead to damnation. That's not fun caring for those people. And there are a variety of different ways in which I can supply the best medical care, but that's tremendously inadequate unless one helps to work with their spirit. The current reality we have is that most people, or at least many, are really afraid of dying. A lot of patients say, I'm not worried about being dead, it's the getting there. And the things that people are afraid of are poor pain control, symptoms that are distressing, a loss of dignity, and that's a very tricky word, and being a burden on their family. The other part I find is a lot of people would just not want to think about death and dying. Some wouldn't talk about end-of-life issues with their family. And aging in the end of life, I think for many people, can present a crisis of meaning for that person. Erickson talked about generativity versus stagnation, the ability to find a sort of successful way to look at your life course. Other people do quite well. I mean, I had the privilege of caring for my mother in her last few years, and she spent a lot of time, she didn't do anything particularly bad, but really making amends for the ways in which she perceived she had failed in her life. And coming to a lot of joy in asking for forgiveness and not always receiving it from everybody in the family, but finally being able to say, I did wrong, I said I'm sorry, I did my best, I'm still sorry for what I did wrong, and I'm so grateful for the love I'm getting in return. And I mean, that was successful aging at the end of life. Other people, we heard about people wanting to hold on to grudges and not forgetting. You all know what Irish Alzheimer's disease is. You forget everything but the grudges. So the number of times I'm taking care of a 90-year-old and they won't see their sister or brother because she took mama's china. I go, who cares? Are you planning to sit down dinner? What's the story? Now, part of the spiritual experience I grew up with, being an Irish Catholic kid south of Boston, is wakes were fun. When I was 5, wasn't it neat to go with my cousin Kevy and see a dead body? That was a lot of fun. And if Mummy wasn't looking, we'd touch it and go, oh, like that. But again, you weren't surprised by the presence of death. Death was very much part of life and ritual. I was dead from praying for a happy grace. There were always, every Mass you'd go to, if you were dragged as a kid to daily Mass, most of those Masses were being said for the dead. The priest was there in the black fiddleback vestments. Now, some of that was really strange, but the other part of it that wasn't was that death was a natural part of life. Now, some of the other things was old age was much younger than it is now. When I go to the Jesuit cemetery out at Weston, and I look, and so I entered in 85, and I look at the ages of the tombstones there. A lot of the guys in 60s and 70s. I go back a few decades, a lot of guys in their 50s. I go now, on Holy Thursday, I washed the feet of a guy who's 99 years old. And when I put the water on Father Fennell's feet, he went, ooh, that feels good. So again, old age is very different now. And life-prolonging interventions were much rarer. I was asking my mom once, her favorite aunt, Aunt Nell, she called Nenny, died the month before I was born, and she had a big stroke in early March in 1956, and she was in her 80s. And so she had the stroke. The doctor came to the house. He said, Nell's had a big stroke. She's not going to get better. And I said to my mother, I said, well, what about a feeding tube? What about that? And she said, have you gone insane? She said she was an old lady. She had a stroke. She was crackers the last 2 years of her life. And so I said, well, what did you do? And she said, what do you think we did? We put her to bed, we kept her clean, we'd boil bouillon and put a face cloth in it and have her suck on it, and then she died. She goes, we spent a hell of a lot of money on your education. How come you become so stupid? And so, there is an element of truth to that. Care was family-based, but here's the other thing. There was a lot more family around to care, which made that easier. So again, there wouldn't be a family to care for Nenny in that same way. When my mother was old, I put her into an assisted living facility near me in Chicago called Resurrection Life Center, which she referred to as Resurrection Death Center, despite the fact that it was a wonderful place, or the GD Orphanage. So, but let me talk to you a little bit about why this is important. I didn't say the words, I just used the letters. I know this is going to be on the internet. What about the demographics of aging? Well, as you know, aging is sort of a revolution with the fastest growing segment of the US population, those over 85. And within that group, the fastest growing segment, those over 100. If you look at what's happening with the population, take a look at those over 65. Right now, it's about 13-something%. By 2030, when I'll be 74, it's going to be 20% of the population. That's a fantastic change. And those small percentage changes over 80, when you think of a country that's over 300 million, that's a lot of people. So what? Social structures are changing. There are obvious changes in healthcare that are beyond the ability of us to predict. Personal and family finances have to be reconsidered, given that you have to have some money around for the long haul. This is going to put tremendous pressures on Medicare and Social Security. And there's a reversal of what's called the demographic pyramid. When Social Security was set up, the biggest part of that pyramid were those people who were 40 and under. Now things are sort of flipped over, so that there's going to be a large portion of the population. It should have been sort of a narrow tip, should have been, or was planned to be that, but instead are people who are older and who might not be generating income. Why are things getting better? Well, it has a lot to do with improved sanitation. If you read that book, John Adams by David McCullough, Why were they always fleeing from Philadelphia and New York? Because of cholera epidemics. You know, we can drink the water here, and that's a big improvement in human life. Antibiotics have made a big change, so you don't die from simple things. The guy that Alexander Fleming, worked on to discover penicillin, he was a London policeman in his 30s using a straight razor. He slipped with the razor and had a bad cut. It got infected with staph. Fleming gave him some of the penicillin mold, but he only had enough for 4 days. It got radically better, and then when he ran out of penicillin, the man died. Imagine dying from a bad cut from shaving. You know, that's just crazy. Baby boomers are entering old age, so there is a bolus of an older population. And fertility rates, that is, the number of kids that younger generations are having, is decreasing, although I see some of us are doing their best to assist with that. If we look at other things now, the geriatrician in me wants to be clear that I'm going to be talking about end of life in a second, but I don't want to equate aging with death, because that's just wrong. Aging is a marker for diversity, not disease. And when I was in practice, which happened until last June, and I would see my sheet for the clinic that day, and I'd look at the ages told me very little. I could have somebody who was 90 and vital and 70 who was a train wreck, okay? The older people get, the less alike they are. We can talk in general terms, but there are tremendous differences among individuals. And so the chronologic age, although there's a common sense way in which you look at it, it doesn't tell you all that much about health or the function of the individual. If I was to go back to that, if you think about people who are aging, again, it's very different than the ways I thought of people when I was a kid. Most folks over 65 live in community. I refer to them as free-range elderly, okay? So these people are not in a poultry farm. They're out there running around, hormone-free for the most part, not living in nursing homes. Most people care for themselves. Again, only 10% of those between 75 and 85 need assistance in the activities of daily living, which are transferring, you get out of bed, toileting, hopefully you make it, showering or grooming, getting dressed, and feeding yourself. If you have problems in more than one of those, it is a very high risk that you're going to need some sort of nursing help. But again, it isn't substantial even in those 85 and younger. What about the characteristics of aging? Now, I'm stealing these from a guy, Ken Meinerker, who is in the aging division at the Mass General Hospital and was one of my teachers. He talks about variable, extrinsic, and intrinsic determinants. It's risky and modifiable. So, what about variability? When I see an older person and I see changes, say, in their blood tests or in their heart function, it can be difficult to separate what you might call normal aging versus what is a disease. A characteristic detrimental change of aging is cataracts. Almost everybody gets cataracts as they age because there's a loss of water from within the collagen structure of the lens of the eye. I'd call that normal aging that's not great. But whether or not somebody, say, has decreased renal function, if you take a look at how we measure renal function, the creatinine, the lab test, with aging there is a characteristic increase in creatinine, which means a decrease in renal function. If you control for that by eliminating the people, by just looking at people who have had normal blood pressure their whole life, their renal function doesn't decline. So does renal function decline because of aging or because they've had poorly controlled hypertension? Probably because it's poorly controlled hypertension, okay? So it's variable. There are extrinsic and intrinsic determinants. Let's talk about diabetes. Diabetes, the type 2, not the kind that the kids get, but the type 2 is really common in the United States and increasingly common in an aging population. There appears to be an intrinsic determinant in that the way the body deals with insulin and glucose changes a bit with age. The effect of that change, though, is seen in a couple ways. First, your fasting blood sugar really doesn't change. Between 40 and 100, your fasting blood sugar might go up a few points. It's not a big deal. It has no real significance. What is different is after you've had a meal or after you've had a stress, if you're infected, your blood sugar goes up a long way. So when an older person shows up in the emergency room with pneumonia, their blood sugar might be 180 to 200, which is about 80 points higher than it should be. When you get the pneumonia fine, they're fine. So what's the intrinsic part? There are changes in glucose and insulin metabolism. What's the extrinsic part? Well, if you don't exercise, if you eat too much, if you sit around, if you get fat, then there are changes that commonly happen with aging that are exacerbated by the presence of obesity and all that other stuff. My point is not to make you little endocrinologists right now. My point is to show you there are ways in which function changes, but there are also ways in which things like weight and exercise can influence it. Now, the other part is aging is risky. We talk about homeostasis, which is the ability of the body to maintain its own function over a wide range of conditions. Let me give you a way too personal example. 2 weeks ago, I got pneumonia. And so, typical doctor, I'm coughing, everyone in the office is yelling at me, I'm not paying attention, and then every night I'm going, gosh, my chest hurts up here, and oh, this cold stinks, and oh, I wish Lent was over, I want to have a drink, and you know, all the other stuff. And so finally, you know, what I would teach first-year medical students occurred to me. Productive cough, fever, and chest pain equals pneumonia, idiot. And so then I call my doctor and say, I want a Z-Pack. He goes, you sound like all my patients. Next thing, it's going to be Percocet, and after that, he said, you come in. I go, oh, do I have to? He goes, shut up. So yeah. What happens, though, is like pneumonia for me was an annoyance. 30 years from now, why was it just an annoyance? My heart works well, my kidneys work well, my liver works well, I have good circulation, I have most of my marbles. As I age, though, there will be changes in those other functions. So you think about life as walking across a tightrope. Different insults, whether they're illnesses or stressors of other sorts, get thrown at us. And it's a little bit like playing dodgeball as you walk across the tightrope. As you get older, the ability to deal with even a small ball thrown at you can knock you off. So as opposed to homeostasis, we call it homeostenosis. You lose the ability to regulate over that range. So even a very healthy older person is at increasing a risk of death, injury, illness from what would be relatively minor injuries. Another example is, say, if someone has a serious burn. If an 18-year-old, God forbid, has a 90% third-degree burn, a horrible injury, they still have a 10% chance of survival. If a 90-year-old has a 10% third-degree burn, they have over a 90% chance of death. Same burn, same thing. It's a question of changes in all the other things so that they don't have the capacity to survive. What about modifiable? I think people know that even if you got bad genes, you can modify or improve your risk. But finally, one of the things to realize is simply being old isn't the problem. I do sometimes with my 80 and 90-year-olds say, there's a bunch of different things and this person is falling apart. But I encourage people to look at the individual things that are falling apart because with a little bit of tinkering, you can help it. I was thought widely insane at Loyola Medical Center 10 years ago for sending a 95-year-old lady for a total knee replacement. I danced with her on her 100th birthday and buried her at 104. Okay? So there are reasons why you do intervene. Many older people have arthritis. Many older people have memory problems or frank dementia. Many older people have high blood pressure. But not everyone gets the same disease. There's a story, it's probably not true, but an old lady, not a very nice old lady, shows up to the doctor and her right knee hurts badly. So the doctor gives her some medicine and he comes back in a month. My knee still hurts. Gives her another medicine, tells her to do some exercises, does that. Comes back in 2 months. My knee still hurts. He switches the medicine again. 3 months. You know, you're a lousy doctor. My knee hurts. And he goes, what do you expect? You're 90 years old. And she said, my left knee's 90 years old and it feels fine. So you haven't explained what's wrong with my right knee, doctor, okay? Now, when you are thinking about how you care for the older person, and particularly when you look at some of the things, an acute illness in an older person, first, you look at that person, you pay attention to the age, but that's not the determining factor. You pay attention to what they are telling you. I pay very careful attention to functional status. So if you ask me, I'm trained as an internist, I got extra training in geriatrics. What was the stuff I learned more in geriatrics? Well, I think part of the important part is I pay attention if somebody can walk, if they can feed themselves, if they can put on their clothes, if they can take a shower, if they can make it to the toilet. Those are not absolute determinants, but if somebody can do those things, I don't tinker a heck of a lot with them and risk causing more harm than good, okay? That's sort of what I do. I paid attention that even in the healthy 95-year-old who I sent for a knee replacement, she had a really tough time with the rehab process, and I knew that, but we got her through it. And here's the hard part that gets you crazy, is reversible illness. One of the dangers is that people will sometimes expect older people to be frail or to be sick or to decline, and you don't look for the thing that could change it all. So an older person is droopy, their blood pressure isn't right, their blood tests are lousy. Well, they might have hypothyroidism, which is really relatively easy to fix. If you say it's just old age and they have one foot on the banana peel, then you're never going to find those changes. So looking for reversible illness is important. And then the other part is when I intervene and the person gets worse, the body is giving me a really important signal that either I've chosen the wrong treatment or the person is beginning to fall apart, that they have lost that ability to react to a stress. And then you have to think, what is the purpose of medical care when you realize a cure isn't going to happen, you might not be able to restore functional status or cease the decline that you're seeing, and it might be time to realize, how do I best care for this person as they face the natural process of death and dying? Now, here are 3 different slides that talk about what I call the trajectory of dying. My dad used to say the grace of a happy death is to be shot by a jealous husband at 90. This particular slide represents that happy death. So you're trucking along, everything's going well, and then boom, the bolt out of the blue. So you have a traffic accident, you have a huge heart attack, you have a big stroke, you're fine, and then you die. That happens to about 10% of us. For others, there's a steady decline and a relatively predictable period where one is considered terminal. An example I used to use, people remember Cardinal Bernardine from Chicago? So just before I started in Chicago, he was discovered to have pancreatic cancer. He had that big procedure called a Whipple procedure. He did really well for about 2 years, and then it recurred, and he died 3 months afterwards. When you have a massive recurrence of a cancer, that's often when you have the steady decline, the recurrence that doesn't respond to treatment in that situation. And people, particularly physicians, other folks, are relatively good at recognizing that's the case. But here's the way most of us die. And so it's a period where you have ups and downs. So you have somebody, say, who has emphysema or chronic bronchitis, what doctors would call COPD. And so they have exacerbations and improvements. And if you think about every valley there as a time they show up in the emergency room, well, the doctors can fix them up and make them better and send them back home. But realize if you were to take the slope of that line from the beginning to end, it's an inexorable path downwards. And so what happens with acute intervention that doesn't look at functional status is physicians, caregivers, family members sort of miss the point that the body is telling you something and this person is declining. And increasingly aggressive efforts to restore functional status may merely prolong the dying process without having much of a return in terms of improving function. Now, guess what? Whoops. Over time, as you have more and more of those crises, so this is somebody with very bad congestive heart failure, very bad emphysema, Alzheimer's disease, those kind of things. Over time, it often appears it becomes an ethical dilemma as you get to some of those last valleys along the way. And there is always a son from California who is a lawyer, who was an absolute hellraiser when he was a kid and has had nothing to do with Mummy for 50 years and has let his sister care for Mama during that time, Mom and sis are pretty clear on what's supposed to happen. But no, he has to show how much he loves Mom by antagonizing the physicians and nurses and torturing her in her last weeks of life. That really isn't a dilemma. And one of the things I find is that people often will look at a much younger population. So I have a 90-year-old lady who has a huge stroke, and someone says it's just like Terri Schiavo. And I go, no, this is not like a young woman dying from a persistent vegetative state. It's an old lady who had a stroke. It's how old people die. Oh, no, 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 this is a tremendous dilemma about feeding and hydration. Well, to look at it that way makes as much sense. When I was back at Loyola on Tuesday nights, they used to have natural childbirth classes in the first floor of the medical school. And the husbands and wives would come in, and the husbands would carry the pillow. They're very proud of themselves. No other man has ever made a woman pregnant. They have a big smile on their face, and the wives are there. Now, the training begins by showing a video of natural childbirth, a normal spontaneous vaginal delivery. If we were to approach childbirth by showing a film of the delivery of conjoined, or not a good term, but Siamese twins, that makes as much sense as the way we look at end-of-life issues and aging now, because we compare them to the rare, tragic situation that is hotly contested in a younger person, where good people disagree, and the idea that death is a natural part of life is forgotten. Many of the dilemmas that we have, I think, are often about communication or education. As again, I was told one day at the Beth Israel by a son of a 90-year-old dad, oh, that sounds like a glorious plan you've given us, doctor, but we're Catholic, he has to suffer. I mean, no, there's plenty of ways to suffer, believe me. But being stupid isn't one of them. And there are issues about fear that express itself in conflict. Americans have a lot of authority issues. Being a doctor and a priest, I sometimes find those visited on myself without my doing anything to have provoked them. But the idea that there are limits in life is something that people who are Americans don't like to hear. Sometimes the dilemmas are about people not paying attention. And here's the saddest thing. When we get back to human dignity and human solidarity, I think we waste a lot of time fighting about an ethical dilemma, because that way we avoid caring for the person in front of us in a way that's sensible. We often are polarized. Now, I think feelings are critically important, but I think feelings need to be modulated by reason. And what we have now, whether it's ethics or the government or most anything in American life, is a mob mentality, where the most vulgar and the loudest appear to have the most influence. Remember when you were kids reading Shakespeare? I think every high school student has had to write an essay on discuss the role of the mob in Julius Caesar. Think about that essay now when you watch television or listen to some of the people, or come by a bedside where you have a family that's all over the place. To give you an example of how things get crazy, this is a slightly modified case. 85-year-old lady who was not my patient, but I cared for her husband. And her son said, would you go and see my mom? And I said, sure. She's not doing well, and da-da-da. So he said, just make a friendly visit. She likes you. It'll make her happy. So she had in the past a stroke on the right side of her brain, so she was blind in the left side of her world, okay? And so she had some problems with perception over above the blindness that happen when you have a stroke that involves the parietal lobe. Trust me, it's okay. I slept in a Holiday Inn last night. It's true, all right? She was admitted with heart failure, and her blood pressure was too high. And they were fixing the heart failure and fixing the blood pressure, but people were saying, you know, she's not eating right. So I came in at about 12:30 in the afternoon, and I walked in, and she's there in bed, and the room smelled good because there was a tray. Where was the tray? Next to the bed on the left-hand side. Could she see it? No. So I take the cover off, and she says, oh, I'm starving in this place. And I said, let me open things up so you can eat. So, of course, everything's hermetically sealed for, you know, hygienic purposes. Starvation is considered a hygienic way to die, I guess. And so, you know, I open the things, give her the spoon, give her the fork, and she says, you know, honey, would you mind feeding me? I go, sure, that's fine. So I fed her the beef stew, and there was a piece of apple pie. I moved that to the left so she couldn't see it, and I ate it later. So she went through the beef stew, enjoyed that, all that's fine. And I come out after having a nice visit, and they're planning to order a thing called a video fluoroscopy and a swallowing study, which is a prelude to often having a feeding tube placed. Now, duh. I mean, the issue is get there and feed the person. Now, one of the big things I academically did a lot with was feeding and hydration issues in older patients. And often people are screaming to me about church teaching and feeding tubes. And I'd say, you know, that doesn't have anything to do with it. You sit down with a spoon and feed her. Oh, well, that's difficult. I go, yeah, and it's highly lucrative to shove a feeding tube down her. It makes it easier to care for that person. That way, God knows you don't have to bother to have an interaction with a troublesome older person. So again, we turn feeding and hydration issues into an ethical dilemma. The ethical dilemma is our human solidarity, that we're too dumb to pay attention to how we care for each other most of the time. Are there real problems? Sure. But again, I was talking about the way things go. We talked about that up and down valley approach with the trajectory of dying. And one of the things that I was brought up with was a curative approach to medical care. So somebody shows up, they're sick, you do the best you can. Whoops, it doesn't work, time to call hospice, okay? A better way to look at it is the opportunity to provide care that recognizes that the treatment is difficult, it might not be ultimately successful, but you want to care for the person in all the aspects of their life, even as they may be approaching the end of life. So that with the person who has bad emphysema, might an intervention be that you get a hospital bed on the first floor of their house so they don't have to climb the stairs. You get a bedside commode for the person who has advanced heart failure so they don't wet themselves because of the diuretic they're on. You do simple things which are not particularly fascinating or brilliant, but lead to tremendous improvements in the person's ability to enjoy their life. You pay attention to the biological, but then you intervene in ways that are often psychological, social, and ultimately allow that person to come to some grips with their meaning, even as perhaps their life is ended. Now, just to mention palliative care more, I'm not going to read the slides, but just to say, you know, the Pope says palliative care is a right belonging to every human being. Sometimes when I'm talking to Catholic groups, they say palliative care is murder. Well, it's not. The next part is take a look at how John Paul II died. And my question is, do you have to die in a way that's more Catholic than the Pope? Okay? How did he die in 2005? In his own bedroom in the Vatican. Now, did he have hot and cold running doctors and nurses? Sure. But did he go to the Gemelli and get on a ventilator and do all that other stuff? No. Did he have fancy blood pressure medications to keep him alive even when he's dying? Apparently not. You know, over the course of 4 days, he'd been sick for 3 months in the setting of a much worse illness. He gets a urinary tract infection, and he dies. That's how old people die. He gradually lost functional status. He had a series of exacerbations in his Parkinson's disease, and finally something that would have been relatively trivial in a younger person took his life. He died at home. He wasn't hospitalized. I think paying attention to that and what he talked about, the relative value of human life on earth, can help us understand how our Catholic and spiritual traditions give us some guidance at the end of life. So what's death about? Well, I think we got a more excellent way in our tradition to face the end of life. And the biggest thing that worries me growing up half a generation older than I am is that we live in a time where people feel very strongly, think they know everything, and don't pay attention to the authentic tradition of the church. So I frequently have Catholics screaming at me that I'm a murderer, or I'm dealing with people who want to take people's lives, when really we have something that is far better. We care for people until a natural death because of the context of our belief in human dignity and human solidarity. That comes from what we just celebrated, that Christ suffered, died, and rose from the dead, and that we have a calling that goes beyond this earth. Those things are countercultural in that they're not all about individualism or that my life is my choice. It has to do with recognizing we're our sisters and brothers' keeper, that youth is swell, but there's also a lot of great stuff that goes on as you age. You have to be careful with words like dignity and quality of life. We understand those in a common sense way. But the issue is, dignity is too often related to whether or not every sphincter works. Let's just say my mother spent the last few years of her life in Depends, and she was still Queen Elizabeth. There was no doubt about that. So the fact that you maybe are missing a couple cards in the deck, that you can't remember what you had for breakfast this morning, that you might wet yourself on the way to the bathroom, does not mean that your life is awful. And if you think it is, you're pretty narcissistic. And a society that looks at life like that as not having quality doesn't have much quality in its perceptions of the meaning of human solidarity and community. Now, I'm going to move since I'd like you to ask some questions. A couple things are, we talked about fear of poor pain control, fear of being a burden, fear of loss of dignity, that kind of stuff. It really doesn't have to be that way. And one of the things I'm proud of is that Catholic healthcare actually is leading the way for this in the United States. The big lie, have you ever seen anyone on those soap operas who dies with their pain well controlled? No, there's always somebody screaming, it's terrible. Here's the truth of the matter. I'm able to make 90% of the patients who I cared for at the end of life comfortable and awake. There are 10% that I had to snow. I didn't deliberately take their life, but I did treat their symptoms. That's Catholic tradition. It's not euthanasia, it's not all this other stuff. It's how sensible people deal with difficult situations within a spiritual and faith tradition. Other symptoms can be treated, not always well. Some of the stuff is tough. The hardest one, constipation. I don't mean to be vulgar, but that is a real problem. My medical students always would laugh when I talk about a problem, and again, it just shows 25-year-olds have never had a problem moving their bowels, okay? That changes when you get older. There are ways to make dying better, and our faith has resources to hope. I said that I grew up in a tradition thinking about the last things, and I remember death, dying, judgment, particular judgment, final judgment, purgatory, heaven, hell, all that kind of stuff. I don't think we need to go back into the morbid particulars that could sometimes be a little bit strange. But I do think we need to pay attention to, we have a purpose to our life, our living, and that goes beyond when we're alive on earth. And we need to prepare for that. I think the idea that our lives are not our own leads to a lot of our culture's difficulty, a preoccupation with a culture of death that's resistant to that plan. Prayer, the sacraments. I always wanted to say the marketing department for Loyola in Chicago never liked this. We had a big billboard on the Eisenhower Expressway 290, one of the main east-west routes coming out of the city. And I always wanted to put up a sign that said, Loyola, a great place to die. 24-hour sacramental services, 365 days a week. Absolute reconciliation no matter what you've done. The body and blood of Christ available to all. Nah, they preferred to talk about other interventions that they had. But we do have a richness in our faith that sometimes we neglect. Now, if we think about all this, I think spirituality is really about meaning. And meaning changes as we get older. Meaning comes from the variety of our experiences as where we began. Our experiences of aging and illness can threaten our sense of meaning as we find different things changing. The intervention of medicine can be wonderful. I'm not one of those people who likes to bash doctors or priests, I wonder why. But it can also lead to an illusory sense of possibility and control. I think the thing that's hard is recognizing decline and death are part of life. We have a society that seeks meaning in activity and entertainment and orientation towards youth. So let me just finish up. I think I've tried to present first spirituality within a context that talks about meaning. Aging is an experience that's marked by diversity, and thus the spirituality with which people will approach aging as well as end of life has a diversity to it. The tradition from which many of us belong, the Catholic tradition, do have resources that shape a person's spirituality and does have a coherent view of aging, decline, and death. But in an age where people are rightly and wrongly terrified of authority and don't seek traditions from the past to apply them to the present, then you have a mob that frightens everybody and can take away the best from the past while making the good people terrified of the future. Ethical dilemmas can be very real, but often they're expressive of other agendas. And finally, healthcare choices in the face of inevitable decline, I think, can be made easier, at least it's been my experience, in a tradition that recognizes death as part of life.